Okay, well, hello everybody. Welcome to the first session of the Stories We Tell. Some of you know already, this is a rescheduled event after cancellation on February 1st due to industrial action in the UK. It was actually an amazing day that saw more than 500,000 union members and supporters in the streets of London. We're all hoping that a victory comes soon after such long years of a struggle for better working conditions. My name is Omar Jabary Salamanca, and I'm a research fellow and coordinator, one of the coordinators of the Observatory for the Arab and Muslim Worlds here at the Université Libre de Bruxelles. And before I jump to the introductions, I would like to say a word about the seminar series and this year's themes. The Stories We Tell began in 2021 as a collaboration with Sahar Saetnia, who is here today with us, and myself, to explore creative and critical archival practices at the intersection of social science and art-based research. If you're interested in this program, you can check on our site to watch the program and the recorded sessions. We will add a link later. Last year, at the suggestion of Johannes Fer, the director of the Maison des Sciences Humaines, it was decided to continue this space as a way to collectively learn from scholars, activists, and artists about critical approaches and methods on a wide range of social, political, economic, and environmental issues concerning the Arab and the Muslim worlds. So the theme for this year, materializing energy geographies, is in many ways a response to the global transformations in the energy sector unleashed by the Ukraine war. We're witnessing major geopolitical and geo-economic realignments, as well as the consolidation of increased oil, gas, and carbon-based production with nefarious impacts on the environment and the most marginalized in society. In this context, it seemed important to us to put together a series to better understand the genealogies and entangled histories of energy across the North Africa and Middle East regions by focusing on questions of finance, knowledge, labor, gender, and resistance. Today, we're really happy and excited to be in conversation with Laleh Khalili, Professor of International Politics at Queen Mary University of London, and Katayoun Shafiee, Associate Professor of the History of the Modern Middle East at the University of Warwick. I won't go into reading the bios of our speakers, but I'll also put a link so that you can all check it out. Laleh will present new work about the ways oil was transformed from the knowledgeable material of everyday life and struggle into an abstract, distant, and illegible subject of a specialized knowledge. And Katayoun will discuss the unexpected and remarkable role that cost-benefit analysis played in governing Iran's democratic future through the assembling of a dam in the mid-20th century. The seminar will take place as follows. We'll have a first block of an hour with the two presentations back to back, about 20 minutes each, and this will be followed by a second block of an hour dedicated to questions and conversations that can draw from both presentations, and we will be done by 2 o'clock. Questions can be asked both by raising the hand option in the chat box or by posting your questions there anytime. Well, I think that's all I have to say, and Laleh, the floor is yours.
I'd like to say thank you to Omar for organizing this, Omar and Sahar for organizing this, for OMAM for having me again, this time virtually. I have been there in person and it's a really lovely group of people. I also want to apologize for any kind of rawness in the material. This is the first proper academic bit of research on the new project, which I'm hoping to work on, which is about what happens in the aftermath of nationalization of oil and sort of the transformations in a lot of different kinds of politics. I would love any kind of feedback, suggestions as to where to look, things to read, and perhaps even suggestions, criticisms of how I'm framing this. Okay, I'm going to start reading. If you have, because I'm going to be reading from my screen, if you have any questions or you'd like me to slow down, please unmute yourself and yell out loudly, and I'll pause. Crude knowledge, decolonization and hydrocarbon epistemes. Abdullah al-Tariqi belonged to a generation of young men and women in the Middle East, indeed the whole of the global South, who in the aftermath of the Second World War and as waves of decolonization swept the region, imagined a different modern future. Tariqi, who was born to a Najdi father and a Kuwaiti mother, had received an undergraduate degree in geology and chemistry from University of Cairo, and from there traveled to Austin, Texas, where in 1947 he graduated with a Master of Science in Petroleum Engineering and Geology, and then worked for Texaco before returning to Saudi Arabia. I feel a little bit of a sentimental attachment to Tariqi, because aside from the fact that he was one of the most interesting characters actually in oil in the 1950s, I also did a degree in chemical engineering at University of Texas in the same building that he was at. So there is this kind of a wild connection. As Mustafa Hafiz Wahba, a Cambridge-educated economist and one of the founders of the Saudi Communist Party, recalls, Tariqi who was placed in the Ministry of Finance in Saudi Arabia, gathered young, educated men around him in order to develop the institutions in this new state. Wahba, this was after 1947. Wahba recalled, we wanted engineers, accountants, and geologists, and this required some time, and we were in a hurry and had no time at all. Tariqi eventually became the minister in charge of the Ministry of Petroleum, or as US Department officials charmingly put it, he was one of the commoners that gained from a political rejigging in Saudi Arabia. As his charismatic ascent to power accelerated, so did the apprehension of Aramco and US officials about him. Diplomatic cables are rife with accounts of his desire to gain sovereign control over the oil in Saudi Arabia. One American diplomat in Saudi Arabia reported to Washington that he had met with King Saud to discuss Tariqi's initiatives, and I'm quoting here. I had great admiration for the honesty and ideals of his director for petroleum affairs, Abdullah Tariqi, but in his oil policy, Tariqi was obviously not thinking in first line of the immediate financial returns to Saudi Arabia, but rather as a political performer. I told Saud that Tariqi had mentioned to a member of my staff his admiration for Mossadegh, Iran's Mossadegh, and his regrets that the latter had not succeeded in his can I ask for people to mute unless they have a question? Thank you. So no doubt Mossadegh's honesty or ideals, so this diplomat is telling Saud that Tariq had told him about his admiration for Mossadegh and his regrets that the latter had not succeeded in his nationalization plans. Parentheses, King burst into scornful laughter at the mention of Mossadegh, parentheses closed. No one doubted Mossadegh's honesty or ideals, but he had cost his country huge sums and political turmoil. Tariqi, who quite frankly was pointing towards eventual nationalization or Arabization of oil production in Saudi Arabia, had caused several potential concessioners and crude oil off-takers to take their business elsewhere. Speeches of Tariqi's American aide, Frank Hendricks, attacking sanctity of concessionary contracts did not inspire confidence to potential concessioners, end quote. So they were really worried about Tariqi's demands to nationalize. All the backstage intrigues by Aramco and US officials and the Sudairi princes, including Faisal and Fahad, both of whom later became king, led to Tariqi's ouster in 1962 and his exile in Beirut and later Cairo. Arabian oil's loss was oil publishing's gain. 1960s and 70s were heady times in the Third World. Demands for sovereign rights over natural resources went hand in hand with demands for sovereign control over one's own affairs. Nationalization of oil across the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America from the late 1960s onwards put in motion what historian Christopher Dietrich has called the most concentrated, non-violent transfer of global wealth in human history. In 1957, almost 64% of the world's oil was owned by US companies, most of which were outgrowths of Standard Oil, while about 15% of the world's oil was owned by BP, British Petroleum, or Shell Oil. This is in 1957. The remainder, a little over 20%, was either owned by smaller European or Canadian firms, or was in the hands of state-owned enterprises in the Soviet Union and Mexico. By the late 1980s, the firms owned by the Seven Sisters had passed into the hands of state-owned enterprises. The larger project of which this is a part of, this paper, is about the processes whereby Euro-American capital tried to recuperate its losses in the aftermath of this transfer of wealth. The Arabic language magazines and journals that dealt with oil in those decades reflect something of the radical transformation that those decades brought about. Everything about them, their language, their very material field, their editors and editorial boards, their place of publication, and the trajectory of their publication opens a window onto the processes of knowledge production in the region and gradual ossification. In a 1988 bulletin of Brismas, a clearly irritated Obaidli lamented that Arabic periodicals lacked vitality, were published irregularly, and were deficient in their bibliographic data. Though he was right about the irregularity of publication and the lack of consistency in bibliographic data, he was utterly wrong about the oil publications that emerged in the 1960s, their vibrancy, foremost among them Taraqi's. In Beirut, Taraqi and economist Naqula Sarkis set up Markaz al-Arabi lil-Dirasat al-Petroliya, the Center for the Arab Center for the Study of Petroleum or oil-related stuff, which began publishing Majalla al-Petrol wa al-Ghaz al-Arabi in 1965, so the magazine for oil and gas, for Arab oil and gas. The magazine ran for 5 years before changing mastheads and names and became Naft al-Arab, Arab oil. In 1972, Taraqi moved to Cairo and took the magazine with him, but it stopped publishing in 1975. Beirut was also home to A'lam al-Naft, which the world of oil, which began publishing as a weekly in 1968. Majalla, Tariqi's article, Naft al-Arab and A'lam al-Naft were not the first Arabic language oil magazines, however. That honor belonged to Al-Petrol, a quarterly magazine issued by the Egyptian Public Institute for Petroleum, which was itself established by the Egyptian Ministry of Petroleum as the government of Egypt feverishly prospected for oil and gas in the deserts and offshore areas in the aftermath of the rise of Nasser. In addition to all of these, Al-Naft wal-Tanmiya was published in Baghdad between 1975, the eve of nationalization of Iraqi oil, and 1981, which is when the Iraqi-Iranian war really took off. And Al-Naft wal-Tanmiya has the distinction of being edited by Abdurrahman Munif, the great Saudi novelist and petroleum economist. This was a different kind of journal than Majalla or the early years of Al-Petrol. Al-Naft wal-Tanmiya, the one that Munif edited, was inaugurated with the congratulatory letters from Ahmad Hassan al-Bakr and Saddam Hussein, the president and the vice president of Iraq in 1975. Munif frequently wrote political essays in the journal, as did others who were perhaps better known for their literary works. Badr Shakir al-Sayyab and his brother Abdullah, who was a petroleum engineer, and Jabra Ibrahim Jabra had all worked for the Iraqi Petroleum Company, and their names appear at various times in the journal. Other recognizable scholarly figures, many of them Palestinian, were also embedded in the oil publishing sphere. Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OAPEC, established a magazine in Kuwait in 1975, around the same time that the Iraqi magazine started. The inaugural editorial committee of Al-Naft wal-Ta'awan al-Arabi included the Palestinian economist Yusuf Sayegh, the Egyptian economist who had once written for Al-Petrol Mahmoud al-Rushdi, and Walid Khadouri, who many recognize from his other works on political economy, Palestine, and other subjects, was the editor-in-chief of the OAPEC journal. Predictably, this journal was very much policy-oriented and focused on specific technocratic solutions to the problems arising around oil. Now, a series of themes emerged out of reviewing these oil journals over the course of their lifetime. First, the content and form of the journals very much corresponded to their context, both geographic and political. The Egyptian Al-Petrol, which began as a Nasser project, cleaves closely to the politics of successive Egyptian regimes. If it had begun as an Arab nationalist journal publishing memorials to Mohammad Mossadegh's failed attempt at nationalizing Iranian oil, by the 1980s, it primarily uses a language of security and geopolitics. Gone are the celebrations of anti-colonial heroes and full-page advertisements, and now full-page advertisements by British Petroleum dominate. By the 2000s, politics has wholly disappeared from Al-Petrol, and the focus is entirely on petroleum engineering matters. Munif's Al-Naft wal-Tanmiyyah, which was published in Iraq, begins as a serious scholarly journal about oil. But as Saddam Hussein comes to power in 1979, the politics slowly drains out of the journal. Perhaps more surprisingly, the Iranian revolution is not mentioned at all. But on the eve of the Iraqi invasion of Iran in 1980, the journal has an item about the weakness of Iranian economy. Shortly after Iraq invades Iraq under Saddam Hussein, Munif departed Baghdad for Paris and the journal ceased publication. Alam al-Naft, which from the start seems to echo, that's weekly that was published in Beirut, Middle East Economic Digest in its format and contents, seems to have received an injection of funds from Saudi Arabia in 1973. As its page count increases, paper quality improves, and its masthead date is switched from Gregorian to Hijri. The journal shifted to Cyprus during the Lebanese Civil War, but returned in 1991 when it began to be edited by Lebanese journalist Samir Atallah, who also wrote for Al-Sharq al-Awsat and Al-Nahar. The journal wraps up by 1996, echoing the shifts from Beirut to Dubai of a great deal of knowledge and expertise around oil and the auxiliary businesses that sustain it. The second theme that is interesting is the particular ways in which oil is imagined and analyzed begins to shift. Before the nationalization of oil, it is not thought of as the property of states, so much as a common asset intended for use by all Arabs. This, of course, reflects the Nasserist attachments and commitments of many of the young intellectuals and technocrats who saw in oil the possibility of a more equal, less impoverished, even more dignified future. It also reflects the ways in which state ownership of oil put into motion by the nationalization efforts of Mexico in 1938 and Iran in 1951 generated a new way of thinking about oil. While in the US, offshore production became a nub of struggle between states and federal governments, necessitating new laws and institutions. Strikingly, the US federal government claims a claim of sovereignty over offshore oils, subordinating US corporations to its will domestically, while externally the US government defended the rights of its corporations to the detriment of sovereign rights of third world states. Oil as private property becomes a nub of a great deal of legal, legislative, and arbitral struggles in the mid-20th century. Such institutions and other devices, financial and otherwise, proliferated even more wildly after the nationalization of OPEC nations' oil. It is fascinating to see that of all of these journals, only Beirut-based Alam al-Naft, the weekly, is truly alive to the other changes by, for example, foregrounding finance and commodities markets for a time. However, all the Arabic language oil journals do engage with global
approaches without mercy.
With the global legislative and legal struggles, and most of the earlier journals, for example, discussed the Onassis case, which was so crucial in consolidating the power of Euro-American investors over that of oil-producing states. As I've written in the News of War and Trade about the Onassis case, in August 1953, Onassis approached Mohammad Ali Reza, the Saudi Minister of Commerce, to broker a deal with the Saudi government that would give Onassis's tankers the exclusive right to transport Saudi petroleum. The negotiations entailed various one-time and ongoing bribes for Ali Reza himself, as well as the Minister of Finance, Abdullah Suleiman, and other courtiers. The agreement was signed in January 1954. A shipping company, Saudi Arabian tanker company, SATCO, was to be formed, whose tankers would fly the Saudi flag and would have priority in transporting Saudi oil. Onassis was also to establish a maritime college in Jeddah, whose graduates would steam on SATCO tankers. Once the agreement was publicized, it caused a furore that even Onassis, who was a master tactician, had not anticipated. Aramco, which saw the right to ship the oil it extracted as part of the concession it had been granted in 1933, immediately and fervently objected. In the US, concerns were raised about the possibility that Onassis would ship oil to the Soviet bloc. The Dulles brothers, in their role as Secretary of State and the head of CIA, and triumphant in their recent overthrow of Mossadegh's nationalist government in Iran, worried that this deal signaled King Saud's unacceptable autonomy from the US and were troubled by the possibility that he would nationalize Aramco. After all, they reasoned, King Saud had seen a blanket shipping company boycott of nationalized Iranian oil, bringing Mossadegh to his knees. Eventually, in 1956, the case went to arbitration in Switzerland. In its 1958 decision, the tribunal astonishingly decided that because Saudi law did not contain any definite rules relating to the exploitation of oil deposits, this lacuna was filled by the concession agreement, which became the fundamental law of the parties. In essence, the Court of Arbitration was declaring that unless the state had clearly set forth the parameters of any future business with Aramco, the concession agreement that was signed in 1933 essentially was a sovereign document and had the force of law in Saudi Arabia. Further, the tribunal ruled that in its capacity as the first concessionaire, Aramco enjoyed exclusive rights which were vested and could not be taken away from it by the government by means of a contract with a second concessionaire, even if the latter were equally legal. Any Saudi claims to jurisdiction over its own borders or maritime business was contrary to the needs of international commerce and involved the restriction of the principle of the freedom of high seas, unjustified under international law. In other words, the high seas had to be free for Aramco to do its business, though not for Saudi Arabia. Writing in 1966 in the Egyptian Al-Betrol, the Egyptian judge Saad Al-Lam detailed the case in a fairly neutral language, providing a great many details and touching on the complexities of transport and the manner in which concessions were seen as ceding of sovereignty. But beyond focusing on these explicit legal discussions, none of the Arabic language journals pick on other ways that from the 1970s onwards, taxation, accounting for reserves, financial instruments, and new modalities of ownership and pricing were influenced by actors beyond the states. This is in part related to a third thematic that emerges from these journals: the fragmentation of crude knowledge, its transformation from something accessible and inherently political to specialized and jargonized science. As I was researching this project, I was also reading the great John Berger's slender and poignant volume, A Fortunate Man. The book about a country doctor who's something of a polymath allows Berger to reflect on the erosion of what he calls a universal man. For now, please bracket the gendered language, which also says something about this possibility. But this is what Berger writes. He says, the idea of the universal man has a long history. It was the working ideal of Greek democracy, even though, of course, it depended on slavery. It was revived in the Renaissance and became, for a number of men, a reality. It was one of the principles of the 18th century Enlightenment, and after the French Revolution was maintained, at least as a vision, by Goethe, Marx, and Hegel. The enemy of the universal man is the division of labor. By the mid-19th century, the division of labor in capitalist society had not only destroyed the possibility of man having many roles, it denied him even one role and condemned him instead to being part of a mechanical process. Yet the ideal of the universal man persists. It could be the promise implicit in automation and its gift of long-term leisure. If the division of labor, and this is end quote for Berger, if the division of labor reduces people to a cog in the Taylorist machine, diminishes skills and knowledge to something fragmented and anemic, then knowing and acting on knowledge is hampered. One can see something of this pernicious trajectory in the content of almost all of these Arabic language journals. Somewhere around the mid-1970s, as they begin to accept advertising and as they represent the passing of oil from a common good colonized by Euro-American actors to an asset owned by increasingly authoritarian states, the level and quality of the content changes. Articles become much more technical, but also much more opaque. Politics gives way to policy. Language changes from lucid and direct to complex and jargon-ridden. Analysis gives way way to anodyne description. Qualitatively rich material is displaced with incomplete quantitative data and formula and model-riddled articles, cataloging and extracting patterns seed to dull and cliche-ridden bromides that pantomime a kind of analysis. And it is clear that while engineering knowledge has expanded, familiarity with the group of extractive sciences that fall under the rubric of a critical deconstruction of economics or management or accounting has contracted. If these appear at all, they do so as much repeated mantra. I have recounted these three characteristics emerging out of a study of Arabic language oil journals. The forms of knowledge bound in these publications were deeply shaped by their political and geographic context. One can trace a transformation in the representation of petroleum in these journals from a public good to a private property. And this transformation creates a concomitant degradation and ossification in forms of knowledge. I want to leave the conclusion of this essay quite open. I have yet to compare the trajectory of these journals with their Anglophone counterparts over the same period. I suspect the differences will tell us something about the shifting relations of power along different knowledge conduits in the global north. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, thanks, Laleh. Was great. Katayoun, want to take the floor?
Okay, sure. Thank you, Laleh. That was really interesting. So a little bit different, the topic. I've obviously worked a lot on oil, but hopefully the water will also be interesting. And then in our discussion, of course, we will discuss both. I want to talk about the remarkable role of economic science, so kind of coinciding a bit with some of the observations that Laleh made about the oil, production of knowledge around the oil. But in this instance, in calculating Iran's democratic future through the assembly of a dam, a large-scale dam in southwest Iran, in the same place as the oil was located, Khuzestan province, along the Persian Gulf. This is also a work in progress. It forms part of my book project that I'm currently working on. So I'd like to touch on one or two examples, depending on how much time there is. Please let me know if I've gone over, Omar, and I will stop. But the first example will address more specifically the production of economic science around water that was concentrated at the dam site. But then I think it would be interesting to also talk about the soil science that was produced in relation to this agenda of irrigating the land through access to new supplies of water from the dam. So I want to specifically zoom in on the role of a specific technology known as cost-benefit analysis that traveled the world via flows of water. And so the calculation of costs and benefits generated by this device of neoclassical economics became, over several decades in the 20th century, the most influential language for explaining and organizing the relationship between humans and nature, including the soil in southwest Iran. So there were a lot of actors involved, US-based government aid agencies, institutions of global economic governance, such as the World Bank, private American investors, consulting engineers, and soil scientists who together converged in this small corner of Iran to transform the region, its water, and its farmers into a kind of laboratory of grassroots democracy for a profit. And that notion of grassroots democracy for a profit was a philosophy that originated in the Tennessee Valley Authority's model of integrated river basin development. So I don't know, some of you might have heard of the TVA authority. It's famous for developing large-scale dams in the US. And so it's interesting how this philosophy gets disseminated and mobilized in Iran. There is already a significant scholarship on that sort of takes seriously the use and management of the world's fresh water as a site of critical investigation, and of course highlighting the importance of taking seriously the materiality of the water itself. And I'm thinking about contributions from science and technology studies, which is the methodology I like to use in making the infrastructural life of water visible, which is why I'm very much interested in emphasizing the technical and economic features of these projects. But I've noticed that studies have said little about the calculative terms and the knowledge production of the decision-making process involved in appraising these projects, these large-scale infrastructure projects. And so it tends to be taken for granted as something inevitable that also generally overlooks the properties of the water and the soil and how these features of nature are getting transformed through this agenda of constructing a dam, pursuing irrigation and industrial agriculture. So in terms of the specific production of economic science and how it ends up in Iran, this was a sort of US-led global project of river planning or the construction of large dams that hope to implement this new concept known as integrated river basin development. And it couldn't simply be imposed. So this involved a lot of different agencies and planners. So for example, the Development and Resources Corporation was this American private firm involved in Iran. It was headed by the former chairman of the Tennessee Valley Authority, David Lilienthal. And then of course, the World Bank. And in terms of state actors in Iran, the Planning Organization. And together they were sort of attempting to rationalize river planning, and it sort of paved the way in the mid-20th century for this institutionalization of the field of development economics, which was officially dedicated to the study of causes and solutions for so-called economic backwardness. So again, I want to highlight that there is this very specific, less visible actor that emerges to manage all of this, known as cost-benefit analysis, and it was intended to appraise the risks or economic costs and social benefits of river basin development concentrated at the site of a dam. So the goal wasn't simply to develop physical resources such as land, people, the farmers, and water, but it was also to develop a locationless economy in terms of growth. So increasing national income, for example, which was an increasingly prevalent, of course, method used by governments in this period. So like the Aswan High Dam in Egypt, the reliance on these economic models for calculating the desirability of a public works project and the opportunity cost of undertaking the project enabled dam construction to be sanctioned by the logic of state investment in economic growth. So that language of development and the possibility of achieving it in a massive project such as a dam was vital to these regimes' perceptions of why dams were so important to economic development, and helps us to understand how they are getting mobilized around the world. It wasn't an entirely new endeavor. I think it's interesting to think about the genealogy of this, this economic conception of nature and how to use infrastructure to reconfigure it. And so 18th century France happens to be one of the sort of original sites where economic science is punctuated by debates on relations between states and markets, which is converging at sites targeted for public works. So that includes as well canals, roads, and what's interesting is the state's attempt to produce statistical forms of observation to represent these activities. And so we shouldn't take that production of knowledge for granted, because it's happening for centuries, actually, and has interesting origins. And we can also use that to think about the kinds of governance that states are pursuing in order to make these forms of statistical knowledge useful in managing not only the projects, but nature and the population within a specific historical configuration. So there is this remarkable convergence if we look at the genealogy of water management with flows of water in 18th and 19th century France, followed by the US in the 20th century. So you see economic, hydraulic, and engineering knowledge intersecting to transform these states according to new kinds of technologies of governance that end up crystallizing after World War II in the Dez Dam project in Southwest Iran that I'm looking at. And so, you know, the latter periods, the post-World War II period, is interesting in that we see this reorientation of the World Bank from the reconstruction of Europe to the development of its so-called poorest members, and it entails new forms of calculation whereby the costs of a large-scale infrastructure project such as a dam, which is intended to bring electric power and water, new kinds of water distribution, had to calculate a future whereby the task of the sovereign state could be made liable for development loans and thus reduce the risks for Wall Street. And so in the field, in scholarship, in terms of the methodology that we could use to think about all of this, I've drawn from STS once again, who have argued that processes that constitute these behaviors, organizations, and institutions that are qualified as economic highlights a process of economization at play, which allows us to open the political possibility of questioning these calculations and arguments that the different actors are using to shape their actions, and how these arrangements enable them to build a particular world, their world, that is advantageous vis-a-vis, for example, local actors who are also getting transformed into these modern economic subjects. And so, you know, back to the history. So I said that, you know, France is one of the was one of the places where cost-benefit analysis gets formulated. And it's interesting that the French Corps of State Civil Engineers is the sort of agency or institution that has the authority to formally incorporate cost-benefit analysis into the appraisal of public infrastructures in 19th century France. So that included thinking about whether French consumers could be charged for the use and access to water. In a parallel set of developments in the US as well, we have the US Army Corps of Engineers, which was modeled on the French Army Corps, also taking the lead in pursuing the development of American water resources around navigation, flood control, irrigation, and water power in the 19th century. And so it's by the 1920s and 30s that this idea of costs and benefits that affect third parties who didn't choose to incur it, so thinking about populations who live around dams, was formalized within the theory of welfare economics. And it's in the 1930s that the Tennessee Valley Authority consolidates the river as a unit of legislation as well. So it's becoming an economic and legal unit that enables the Tennessee Valley pilot project, which was led by the Army Corps of Engineers, to test integrated river basin development and demonstrate its feasibility, its economic feasibility in terms of achieving economic growth. But there are other agencies involved, the Bureau of Reclamation as well. And it's interesting how these two institutions provide, by the 1930s, the largest sort of core of experienced river basin managers to the world. And so that includes Iran. But I want to argue that this work of determining costs and benefits wasn't simply a technical matter. The economization of water in the format of cost-benefit analysis was from the beginning intended as a strategy for limiting the play of politics within public investment decisions. And that, of course, has consequences for democratic possibilities and more equitable forms of control over nature. So in our instance, the water, but also the soil. And so zooming into the Iranian case, we also have, for example, the Harvard Advisory Group providing seminars and sending its academics and consulting engineers to help investigate ways, the Iranian government to investigate ways of improving and planning this idea of multi-purpose water development. Beyond that, the Shah himself is very much in support of this agenda. He says, for example, that the rediscovery of water may prove a more meaningful factor in the future growth of Iran's mainland than the voyaging to outer space. And national post-colonial leaders, including Nehru in India and Nkrumah in Ghana, Nasser in Egypt, are embracing this growth mindset, this economic growth mindset as a metric of development. So by the 1950s, even within Iran, you see this transformation of water as a unit of legislation. And you see Iran producing a lot of statistical information. So there's a handbook of agricultural statistics that's compiled by a research attaché at the American Embassy in Tehran, for example. But Iranian engineers as well are mixing engineering with economics and development theory within a hydraulic engineering journal that is also conceiving of water in economic and technical terms, calculating risks of flooding and the costs, but also thinking about these other big themes, that are dominant in the world, such as feeding larger populations, addressing the problem of water scarcity and agricultural productivity. So in all of that, I'm interested not only in that process of producing that economic and technical knowledge and the role of that calculative device in bringing these actors together and transforming nature, but also all of the problems that ensue, all of the uncertainties, because it's not perfect and you cannot simply impose this idea on the ground. And so a lot of my sources talk about, sort of make visible the thinking of David Lilienthal, for example, who headed the company that was leading this in Iran. And, he's very worried about demonstrating the feasibility of this dam project in order to gain a loan from the World Bank, because the formulas are all the formulas that the different engineers, the different agencies that are coming in to assist are very different. And how can we demonstrate the economic feasibility of the dam when we aren't even unified in our methodology? So there's that uncertainty. But then I'll just quickly talk about the soil, because what's interesting in all of this is that Iran's soil is actually highly saline. The soil in Southwest Iran has a high salt content. And it's interesting that, so it isn't actually good for this pursuit of industrial agriculture or irrigation connected to these large-scale dams. And so I also sort of trace how this philosophy of economic growth and training locals to pursue so-called modern techniques of agriculture can't work unless the soil is proven to be sort of feasible as a site for the production of new kinds of cash crops, such as sugar, for example. And so the other big actor in all of this is the Food and Agriculture Organization. And they do a lot, have a lot of meetings and conferences, and they travel to Iran to kind of teach and demonstrate the possibility of pursuing irrigation and industrial agriculture. So it's also interesting to see those connections coming together with the DES Dam project. And then, of course, you have these national institutions, national irrigation institutions, water and power authorities that are completely different in terms of how they manage water in Iran from earlier forms of water use and infrastructure. And so I also talk about that in the larger work. And so I guess I'll just conclude that in following the production of new ways of representing the water and the soil, we see that it has obviously this legitimating effect, this authorizing effect, which allows the avoidance of emergent questions of property rights, of political struggles around water and the soil, as well as the redistribution of wealth. So I'll stop there, and then hopefully we can have a discussion.
Great, fantastic, thank you. Yeah, those were two fantastic presentations. I think there are indeed a bunch of overlaps. They were really is really two very distinct resources that have more overlaps that we usually grant them, water and oil, and we haven't talked much about that today. But really, it's about the epistemology of how these, communities get created and abstracted, and I think in doing that methodologically, what we have here is a sort of like a different perspective on the kinds of sources that we can look at, right? So whereas Katayoun is more looking into FAO and the World Bank and the Tennessee Valley Authority and these engineers and engineering knowledge, which is also economic knowledge at the same time, very technopolitical knowledge. Laleh is looking at that from what can be sort of like a very different perspective on looking at magazines that have been until now somewhat neglected or until recently neglected. And maybe one of the questions would be for Laleh as to why do you think these sources, these archives have not been sufficiently looked at? And you did mention a little bit. And what is it you hope to find in them that is maybe different from other kinds of work that have been looking at, these other distinct actors? No, like who is writing in these magazines? You already mentioned a little bit, but I think it's much more broad, particularly in that moment where oil is still considered a central element for this sort of struggle for national sovereignty, right, in the aftermath of liberation. And maybe another question also to Laleh is you've sort of like mentioned a lot of different contexts, and I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit more at where are you looking at a particular place in order to think this through, and what are those places? Are you going to extend that? For instance, I don't know if Libya was part of that or not, and why. And maybe a third question also, just to say more about, and I think that book that that you mentioned, on oil revolutions that precisely talk about oil. What was it? Yeah, the book by Dietrich. I was recently reading, and it does talk about that precise moment of how OPEC members are trying to regain control. And maybe if you can say something more about that. And for so with the other presentation, Katayoun, yeah, I was wondering if in terms of the cost-benefit analysis, is this something that builds from your work on oil? Was this cost-benefit analysis anything or similar, formulas being applied? Because I do think that you deal in your book with a series of formulas and how that maybe sort of talk to your current work, and how is it similar or different. I have more questions, but I think I'll leave it here, and then I'll just invite everybody else to either sort of like open your mic directly and do your question, or put it on the chat box and we will read it for you. But we're in a cozy setting, so you're all very welcome to do that. I don't know if anybody has questions immediately, and if not, maybe we just, okay, yes, we do. Sahar and Jihan.
Should we start now with the questions? Yeah, directly, sorry.
Should.
Okay, so thank you very, very, very much to both of you for these presentations that I find are tackling very seminal yet understudied processes in the region, but in the case I know more, Iran too. And what I saw common shared, one of the many points that both of your presentations sharing and interest me, is the transnational circulation of norms of savoir-faire, how these norms used in Iran are not just simply imposed, top-down imposed, but are sometimes and somehow co-produced. And in this perspective, I was wondering if you had information about the professionals, the experts involved in for example, in the dam project that are working in or within the Iranian organizations, or the experts producing knowledge about oil and that are published in the different magazines. That what did they study? What was their curriculum? Where the trainings they organized, and were the members of international professional associations, for instance, where they shared afterwards their experiences, like so, and how do you methodologically, if this is something you do or you're interested in, how do you objectify, uncover, make sense of these networks of experts and professionals, engineers, etc. I don't know if it's very clear as a question, but thank you very much again.
Do you want me to ask my question now, or we?
Yeah, I think we can take another one, and then we let Laleh and Katayoun respond. Yeah.
Laleh, you are outstanding. I every time, and Katayoun, it's the first time that I hear you, and it was really good. And thank you, both of you. Actually, when you talked about the publishing editors in Beirut or in and the link between those political thinkers and economists like Youssef Sayer and Abdulrahman Munif and Jabra and all of that made me and I think there is something to do about political thinkers left with, because Youssef Sayer was working with the Palestinian officials, and then he founded with Anis Sayer the Palestinian Research Center, and they had a view of the Arab world that is maybe different from Abdulrahman Munif or Jabra. So how can we think today, if we have to link those political thinkers with their economist thought, and who is financing them, and where are they speaking from? And they are all speaking actually from Beirut in the 70s and 80s, which make me and my question on the book of actually I want there has been like with Franck Mermier, we were thinking of translating books that were never translated from Arabic into French books, not only text. And one of them was الديمقراطية أولاً والديمقراطية دائماً of Abdurrahman Munif, which is not very well known, even in the Arab world. It's not very well known. And how he managed to be a novelist, an economist, and a political thinker, and diffuse his thoughts. And is there different movements in this during this area, and could those political thinkers who wrote in the journal dedicated for petrol and oil take some distance to express their own thoughts? And thank you very much, both of you. Unfortunately, Katayoun, I'm not very, I don't know a lot. I'm ignorant a little bit on what
Thank you very much for these questions, Katayoun. I actually love your paper, and in part because the whole construction of dams, etc. In particular, I was interested in that period and what the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers did. And I wrote an article about U.S. Army Corps of Engineers infrastructural projects in the Middle East. I was mostly talking about roads and things like that, but they were very, very involved. I mean, they brought the whole cost-benefit analysis, which they took from the French Corps via Jomini, and West Point was originally an engineering school, essentially, via all of those, and they brought it. It wasn't just about Tennessee Valley and sort of the whole Keynesian project. It was also about a project of sort of in the US. It was a project of dominating the indigenous Americans, like as Nick Estes has written about. But when they brought everything else over to the Middle East, in particular, it's fascinating. I'll send you, I'll email you this book that I've got, which is downloaded from their website. They talk extensively about all of the projects that they had in Des Foul, right around the same time as the Stade de Des was being built. And all of their projects are non-agricultural, non-power related. They're all related to military establishments, roads, etc., etc. But there is something going on in Des Foul, and then they've got a project going on in Sanandaj, and then they've got projects going on in Khorasan, and then in Baluchistan. And it seems to me that there's something going on in these projects, which is not just about economizing, but it's also about pinning borders down, creating these national security spaces, and the sort of the transmutability of the knowledge between the commercial sphere and the military sphere here, the way it's fungible and it moves forward and backward, and it seems to be completely and totally interrelated. To me, it was really, really interesting. I didn't actually know about all of these other, bodies that were involved with Stade de Des. It's fascinating. I'd love to talk to you sometime about it, and I'd love to read what you're going to be writing about it. Not my area of research, but it is so fascinating. Another reason that I find it fascinating is because, of course, that Stade de Des is being built in Khuzestan, which has all of this oil, which you're going, there's something kind of a little bit odd about producing an alternative source of energy to oil being, pumped just down the road. And so what I would love for you, when you get a chance, to say something about how did they justify the location of Stade de Des there, rather than go to one of the, rivers on the other side of Zagros or further north. So those are my questions for you, and I'll send you that US Army later. Okay, on the questions, Omar, why these journals and what does this project do? These journals are the ones that were sitting in the basement of American University in Beirut. And when I spent the summer there and I was just going around the stacks, I noticed that there's a really rich kind of body of oil journals. And this was when I was working on my shipping article, like 10 years ago, 6 years ago, shipping book. And so in a way, I wanted to sort of look at them. And this started looking. And once I started sort of just looking at certain things, it became clear that these are absolutely unbelievable, really amazing resources. And nobody actually goes down and looks at them down in the basements. It's like in this room, which is being used kind of for storage in the American University Library, which is a real shame because it is an unbelievable resource. I don't think anybody else has such a complete collection of Arabic language, economic and oil journals of that time. So I started looking at those, and what this is part of a larger project in which I'm trying to say that after the nationalization of oil, there's an attempt to recuperate the wealth that was lost through that transfer of title deeds to the oil itself. And that project entailed expansion of tax, accounting, rules, complete transformation in sort of legal bodies, which I mentioned a little bit with Onassis's case, but also finance, shipping, other things. And so this is a very, very, very early doors project in which I'm sort of saying this is what people were talking about. And it's essentially a way for me to A, have an excuse to go through all of these journals, and B, to really look at the way the discourse about them was changing in the Arab world. Am I going to include Libya? Perhaps because of the fact that, to those who don't know, I'm going to be moving from Queen Mary to Exeter in June, and I'm going to be a professor of Gulf Studies. Partially because of that sort of Gulf Studies element, I'm probably going to focus on the Gulf, but also that allows me to sort of narrow it down. I will inevitably have to look at Libya, I will have to look at Iran, I will have to look at Venezuela and Mexico in particular, and Azerbaijan. But I think that I'm going to try and narrow my focus down on these Gulf studies, on these Gulf oil producers. Tahar's questions were for Katayoun, but you did say something about transnational circulations of norms. And I think that it's not just norms that are being circulated, it's also revolutionary thought. And that's what partially is fascinating to see in these journals, is that this is a from below development of a series of ideas about how there needs to be sovereign third world control over their own natural resources. And I think that to me is really fascinating. I would love to know what Katayoun thinks about that transnational spreading via the professionals, because I think that is something that I'm also interested in. Jihan, you had a question about how do these literary figures end up working on petroleum? I mean, just remembering from my own childhood, all of my parents' generation had technocratic education, because what they were doing was they were learning modern sciences that they were going to that was going to help their country, their respective countries modernize. But they all were unrequited poets and novelists and social scientists, and and so that's kind of a idea that they were really, what they wanted to do was sort of the literary work, but what they were really doing was something to help their countries through this very technical forms of knowledge, was I think quite widespread. You also see it in places like in some of the decolonizing countries in Africa and elsewhere, where Middle Easterners, South Asians, Africans, those younger folks want to do all of these things. And that's partially why the John Berger quote about the universal man really appealed, that they didn't feel like they had to be that they had to divide their literary ambitions from their their ideas as an economist or as an engineers or as whatever. That partially explains why so many of these people went into that. There was also a much more pedestrian reason. It paid, right? if you're publishing novels and you can't afford, to live off of that publication, then you go and pay for these oil journals. How were they funded? Well, obviously the one that Al-Bitrol that was published in Egypt was funded by the Egyptian Ministry of Oil. Al-Naft Tanmiya in Iraq was funded by IPC. Weekly, was, I think, published by a kind of like a Middle East Economic Digest type thing. It was a weekly magazine, and I think everybody bought it because it was like this very useful little, compendium of news. And I think it was like a trade thing that traveled through the Middle East. You can see it by the way that they cost different countries, prices at the back. And then, of course, OAPEC funded the one that was published in Kuwait. In terms of why, these were funded, I think some of it was nationalist reasons, some of it was socialist reasons, some of it was political reasons, and some of it was, that sort of impulse to help your country by being modern. And all of these editors and writers do come from different backgrounds. They're Nasserists, they're Baathists, they're socialists, and I think that that's what brings them all together to do the kind of work that they're doing. In fact, it's much clearer who funds these journals in the 1950s and 60s and 70s than it is much later. So there's many of the newer journals, it's almost impossible to figure out who funds them, whereas these earlier journals are very, very open about who funds them. The Taraiki one is the most interesting. He was extremely well known and very, very well loved through the Arab world at the time, because he was this revolutionary red sheikh, and he was also very good looking, and he was very charming, and he spoke multiple languages, etc., etc., etc. And he and Nakoula Sarkis set up a consulting firm for oil. And the magazine initially was a kind of a calling card for the consulting business, but it eventually became everything in itself. So everybody was buying that because they all wanted to know what the Red Sheikh was doing. So I think that's the element of, kind of socialist, nationalist, anti-colonial celebrity element definitely was something that worked with Taraiqi's piece. Anyway, thank you very much.
Shall I go next? Okay. I can give Laleh some questions as well. I don't know. I didn't actually have a chance to respond to you, and I can also answer mine. It's really interesting, and it's nice to hear what is going on from the 50s onwards. Of course, in the Arab world, where you have these new oil states producing a lot of knowledge about the oil in the context of nationalization. I have a couple of things. I mean, I'm just the immediate thing is who is reading this, what is the audience, and what is the reception of this, these journals and magazines. But in terms of your overall kind of thinking of it and the themes that you are connecting to it, I'm just wondering about this trajectory where you're saying it's getting the information about the oil is more and more jargonized and scientific and financial. Because of my understanding of what happened in Iran in the first half of the 20th century. So in my opinion, a lot of the formulas and economic thinking is actually originating in the 20s and 30s, because that is when the kind of monopolization is getting built, the kind of international oil economy is getting built in terms of the monopoly over oil supplies. And that is linked, of course, to the concessionary contracts. But in that process, they need to create these calculative devices. So you need to find a way to represent how much oil there is under the ground, and how to price it, and they need to agree on it. Of course, these emergent, large-scale Anglo-American companies that include Anglo-Iranian, but then later, and of course, the precursor to Aramco. And so, I think you might, make a case that actually a lot of the jargonization originates in the 20s and 30s, when this geological, scientific, and economic knowledge is getting worked out in Iran, and probably Mexico and Venezuela. So yes, but I think it's really important that you're emphasizing that content in these journals, because it would, it helps with thinking about the materiality of the journals, and not just the kind of diplomatic, political identity politics. I think it's worth really thinking about the trajectory of how oil is getting represented, that has a longer history in the first half of the 20th century. And then also maybe like thinking about oil strikes. I mean, you were contextualizing the context of these journals politically, and I think also do worker strikes play any role? There's a lot in Saudi in the 50s and 60s as well, because a lot of these figures, to kind of take over the model, the corporate model that is created by the Americans and the British, and that involves the kind of racial technical management of labor. And so, yeah, they have to find ways of responding to that as well. And I wonder if that comes up at all. So those are some immediate thoughts, but it's really interesting. I look forward to reading about it. And that maybe, I guess you'll answer after. I will answer my own questions. Okay. So yeah, that kind of, I mean, Omar, that kind of talks to my interest in formulas. I think cost-benefit analysis emerged in my research into World Bank documents about Iran. I realized that a lot of the technical thinking, a lot of the conflicts and crises have to do with proving that these projects make sense and are feasible and deserve loans. And so formulas keep popping up in my research, and it happens with the oil. And of course, I think this is obviously peculiar and characteristic of 20th century, 20th century historical transformation, where nature is very much getting transformed in economic terms, which has to do with, British followed by American hegemony in the region. So yeah, I think formulas need to be taken seriously. That has to do with my kind of socio-technical understanding that they also shape the agency of the human actors in these histories, specifically around the decision making, but also necessitate controlling the physical world, not just the infrastructure, but the soil and the water, in order to prove that the formula makes sense. And that also speaks to the question about transnational knowledge networks, because the only way that this industry or this corporation or this World Bank or the oil company can function and can have their authority is to have these communities, these specialist communities that create the information and then publish about it and, discuss it, not only in the local, oil regions but at the site of the dam, but also abroad in international, oil congresses or irrigation conferences. So it's very useful. I think of these networks as a part of this, active network where you have to connect the local to the regional, to the national and international, in order for the world of large scale dams or the world of oil to operate without instability and to operate advantageously, of course, to the exclusion of the, non-elite or local communities, the farmers, the oil workers who are attempting to have a say in the decision-making process, but are losing out significantly in terms of the power relations. And yeah, I would look forward to thinking more about, Laleh, your points. It's really interesting what you said about Desfoul and what else is happening. The location, the justification of the location. I think Khuzestan was considered to be a place where you have some important rivers running through it. So the possibility of producing food for the population, which is really important after World War II, this idea of food security, allows for the justification of having the dam in Khuzestan, but I think, of course, also connects to these other plans about building a petrochemical industry and how the oil revenues are not only being used by the plan organization to invest in these infrastructure projects, but they are also thinking about new projects around oil, and that would involve the petrochemical industry, but also expanding the electricity network, connecting Abadan, where the oil refinery is, to the dam as well, and so there's all this interconnection in terms of why the dam site makes sense in southwestern Iran, and it is really interesting that it's an independent project to the plan organization, but the plan organization, is involved because these state officials have training in development economics, interestingly, and that was another question. They are trained, abroad. Some of them have trained in the US, and some of them have trained in Iran as well. But within Iran, you see the emergence of these new agricultural colleges that are also teaching these new techniques of farming. So not just economics, but also engineering and agricultural science. It's all happening in this period. And so that circulation of training and knowledge is interesting to consider through this dam project. I think that's it. Those were the only questions that I had. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the comment of Jihan as to why would they write in these magazines and work for these companies. And I was just thinking that Jean-Luc Godard, for instance, one of his first films as well was on filming a water dam in Switzerland, and so was Bertolucci, La Via del Petrolio, no? So they would sort of like work for these sort of like state companies and probably get funded to begin. But I wanted to add, before I give the floor to Ala, in terms of, so Laleh made a comment, no, with regards to how these sort of infrastructure projects do open the door to other projects, no? So in that process of like devising calculative devices, there's a process of abstraction, and I was thinking, for instance, as well, how in Jordan, for instance, the Tennessee Valley Authority also came as a way to develop a project to resettle Palestinian refugees in the aftermath of the Nakba, right? So whereas, I don't know, what I understood from Laleh is more like, thinking about counterinsurgency, for instance, and thinking about these projects, but also how ultimately, in the Golan in Jordan, this project was not really successful at neither distributing land nor, being able to resettle a lot of these populations. But one of the questions for Katayoun that I had is, it's like when you're developing and these calculative devices and you're bringing here water and soil, I wonder if you've already come up to terms or found something on your material that speaks to how all these engineers were going about trying to think transdisciplinarily. Was there such a thing happening? Was FAO or the World Bank or any of these institutions bringing together people that knew about soil and about water? Was that a thing? And how did that kind of evolve? Or like, were there frictions or there was no interest whatsoever? So that was one of the questions. And for Laleh, it's like, again, it's like the question of, Sanaz Shorabi, which is somebody we've had here in our previous seminar series, her new project is working with OPEC and is drawing on, many of these sources, magazines and other paraphernalia, even like stamps, so there's like a very wide range of, but what I it's like what I find interesting is how perhaps certain of these material which speaks to the very transnational nature of this sort of post-colonial project of sovereignty kind of it's made disappear, and not just because the sources are not there or because somebody found that these Arab sources were spread and irregular, or whatever the argument is. No, what is it that is goes amiss in this moment of transnationalism, right? And how that could inform or not sort of potential political projects. And I'll shut down here. And Ala wanted to ask a question. Yeah.
Thanks, Laleh. First of all, congratulations congratulations on the new position. I love the way you just dropped that in the conversation. It's like a huge deal. I wanted to ask you about really where you ended, about the kind of the points that you made in which you described how the kind of output in these publications moves from the politicization of the concepts of sovereignty over natural resources and so on, to the anodyne and to the kind of technologicalization, or the process of making energy just a technical commodity, right? And you mentioned going from politics to policy, and you described that well. But I want to start off there, because the consequences of that, the trajectory of that until today is quite clear to everybody, that kind of energy as a commodity is taken away from the political realm and the idea of rights to energy into the realm of this kind of invisible commodity that's governing a lot of people's lives in the region. Now, my question really is that socio-technical boundary that gets established in the, I think, mid to late 70s, and the depoliticization of energy in that sense, through your understanding of this kind of intellectual genealogy of these publications, what happens? Will you be telling a story of what happens to these intellectual elites? Because this is what Dietrich also talks about in his book. He says the problem with these intellectual elites, and they were anti-colonial at that time, is that they are elites. And they then become easily co-opted within these regimes, and they move on, and each one has a story, and they become agents of the state in some form or another within that kind of oil economy. And I find that story always gets missed out when there's a valorization of the decolonial and the anti-colonial, which is fantastic. But then I look back at Obaidli and what he's, what tool he's playing, for example, in Bahrain, and I'm like, well, that was great, that didn't last long, and why didn't it, right? Because and how do we repoliticize energy again and bring that sense of energy justice back into everyday citizens thinking around the right to energy, for example? Thanks.
I knew you'd ask about Obaidli. That's why I made sure I put it in there. Can I answer these questions, Omar? Great, thank you. Katayoun, thank you so much. Of course, I've read your book, because I'm trying to also sort of talk about the pricing formulas, but after nationalization, and the way that those pricing formulas end up being essentially cancelled through the incorporation, of course, of derivatives and options and speculative sort of pricing processes. What is interesting to me, and I think perhaps maybe I should actually start with that puzzling process, is that if you have shown so clearly that calculative process starts in something like Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, Anglo-Persian Oil Company in the 1920s and 30s, why is it that the Arabic language magazines, which are even technical and are being even sold to sort of technical audiences, why is it that they're not jargon written until the late 70s and 80s? And I think that is the puzzle that I'm trying to work with to some extent in this paper. And I think that you actually asking that question really clarifies that, because I am completely in agreement that there is a jargony language that is happening elsewhere, and it's happening in the paperwork, and it's happening in the contracts, and it's happening in the ways in which it shapes the oil industry, but that language doesn't appear in these magazines, and I think that part of that is, of course, precisely because of who has control over the oil, right? So the moment that you have control over the oil, you're looking at these calculative things as a way of understanding that object that you have now as a property of the state. Whereas or it used to be the property of the corporation. Whereas I think when these guys are writing, they are, even the ones that are writing for OAPEC are not writing as representatives of the state. They are writing as intellectuals that are working on a magazine that's published by the state. And I think that distinction partially gives them a certain degree of freedom to write about the kinds of things that they want to write, until the oil is nationalized, at which point all of their writing ends up becoming anodyne and apolitical, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that distinction, that periodization is quite important. And I think that, as I said, I have to clarify that when I edit this. Who's reading these journals? They have different readerships. So the OAPEC journal is probably read by all of the people that work in the oil ministries, economics ministries, finance ministries, etc., in all of the Arab world, not just the oil producing nations, because a lot of these journals are talking about sort of consumption, energy, hydrocarbons beyond oil, sort of gas, petrochemicals, things like that. And so I think there is a readership for the more technical journals within these industries, professionals that are reading this. The weekly that was being edited by Sami Atallah, I think it's read by anybody who's interested in, economics. The fact that it publishes and it looks like a magazine rather than a journal, and it comes out so frequently, and it's cheap and cheerful. I think it says something about the fact that its readership is much wider than you would imagine. The Taraqi thing comes out every 2 months, and so I think it is more like a magazine. And of course, at the time that it was coming out, the Beirutis, were putting out all sorts of literary magazines and political magazines that were coming out monthly or bi-monthly or whatever. And so I think this belonged to that category. It wasn't a technical magazine, even though its subject was oil, etc. It was a political magazine about oil. And I think, again, that's a good thing for me to clarify. The final thing on worker strikes. Aside from Al-Bitrol, none of these magazines were published during the time where you had the big strikes going on in Saudi Arabia. That went on until 1956. None of these journals, with the exception of Al-Bitrol, were published during that time. And Al-Bitrol doesn't mention anything about those strikes, interestingly, especially given the tensions between the Nasserist project and the Saudi project. So there's no mention of that. However, later on, all of them have fairly generic discussions of previous labor organization, but it's generic and completely and totally and not in any way endangering or sort of threatening anybody. So that also says something to the question that Allah asks, and where is it? What happens to these people? Well, a lot of them sell out. And those that don't sell out retire, and or like Abdurrahman Munif goes into exile in Damascus. Taraqi goes into exile in Cairo. They end up, dying in the case of Taraqi in obscurity. And so it's or they end up going and working for the states, as a number of these people do. And then you have the Palestinians. You have Sayegh, who ends up working on until he passes away on these kinds of political projects that have to do more with Palestinians and Palestinian political economy. That question of incorporation of these people into the state project is definitely something that I am going to be writing about. Omar, what happens? Why are these transnational projects made to disappear? And then what happens when it goes amiss? I mean, what happens after these? Well, I'm hoping that the larger project is about what happens, when these transnational projects fail or essentially are co-opted by the state. What happens if we don't? I mean, on the one hand, there is a lot of interest now in the 1950s anti-sort of colonial movement. On the other hand, there's and I have always been interested in that. On the other hand, there's a lot less on what happens in that little transitory period after decolonization to the sort of the consolidation of these authoritarian powers. And that is actually the period that I'm really, really wanting to talk about. And I want to talk about it in the context of a set of global relations. So the rise of authoritarianism in these places, the rise of sort of authoritarian control in these places, the sort of the major capitalist project of incorporation and exploitation is inseparable from everything else that also happens in Europe. So I think that intermixed project, interlinked project is what I'm hoping to write about. Now, hopefully, inshallah, I'm going to have research time at Exeter that I can do because I haven't had any at Queen Mary. So we'll see how that goes.
Yeah. Hi, Tom, you want to go?
Sure, sorry. Yeah, hi, thanks for having me along, everyone. Can you hear me okay when I ask my question?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Laleh, I'm not expert on OPEC, but I've worked a lot on energy conservation, and I know that like petroleum conservation was one of OPEC's 3 main goals. And I don't know what status it had within OPEC as a goal, and whether it's something that's discussed in these magazines, and whether it's because you say, you know, the language kind of drops off from revolutionary discourse to a kind of like technocratic economistic language, but I wonder if conservation continues. My hunch would be somehow it does, but you could probably tell me more. And I have a question for Katayoun as well, if I am allowed. Yeah, I was super interested. I really like that line that CBA traveled with the flow of the water. And I've done some work on the RAND Corporation in the 60s and 70s in the US, and they had this public programming budgeting system, which is like turbo cost benefit analysis. It's like cost benefit analysis meets systems analysis. And the first place they used that was the Grand Canyon. There was a hydroelectric plant there. So I wonder, I don't know, like given the Des Dam is around the same time as like the Kennedy era, and Liz Pott Berman's book, Thinking Like an Economist, is really good on Rand's influence on policy in the Kennedy era in the United States. I just wonder if that's also a genealogy of the economistic rationales governing the Des Dam that you're looking at. But yeah, thank you both for the great talks.
Katayoun, you wanna? I don't know if you had some also pending questions, but just feel free to go.
Okay, sure. I mean, just to respond to the last question, no, thank you. I'll take note of the thinking like an economist. I mean, I have to think about it more. I think there are definitely connections. I don't know the systems analysis. I have to see what that's about. But there must be connections there with what's going on with RAND. I mean, it's in public administration. It's used today, you know, so but yeah, I thank you for that, and I will think about it more. I don't remember, was there any other questions that I had to answer? Sorry.
Yeah,
No,
I did
Oh, sorry, you asked about transdisciplinarity. Yeah, that's true. I mean, so again, in France, I mean, you see how these, you know, these disciplines, their boundaries don't really hold, right? And so the people, the engineers and the economists themselves are acting like, you know, sociologists. You know, this is of course an argument from STS that you can't, you know, when you follow the actors themselves, they are not respecting the boundaries of their discipline, so to speak. So, you know, in France, the Army Corps, they're also thinking about social welfare and whether people will want to pay for the water. And so it's interesting how the engineering and the economics and the hydraulics, that knowledge is intertwined even in its construction, even though in spite of the insistence on the disciplinary borders. So yeah, it's worth commenting on as well. So thanks for telling me. Yeah, I mean, I did have one comment for Laleh that I forgot about the law. and the arbitration, that the case about the tankers is really interesting, because I looked at that, and it's I think something that Christopher Dietrich has also spoken about, international law. So I think that's a really interesting angle to talk about what happens from the 50s onwards, if you can. I mean, because what happens is the concession as a kind of economic development agreement, is in the international legal case with Iran and the nationalization, that the concession, gets reconfigured into this kind of transnational law that allows corporations to have agency in international law, and therefore you have these new contracts, development agreements, that allow for their agency to continue and be represented in law. And so I wonder if that is something you can talk about more in what you're finding, because it's true, and I think its origins again are coming from the 1930s national cancellation of the Iranian oil concession. But there are a lot of arbitration disputes, as you probably know, with the Gulf states from the 1950s, and it comes up a little bit in the Dietrich book. So that's a really interesting angle in thinking about how the oil is, suddenly its conception is being thought about differently and in more technical legal terms, perhaps. So that's it.
Jihan?
Yes, actually, I was thinking about, again, on those publishing on petrol and oil, and the position of the writers, who are also the thinkers that we know, and the novelists that we know. Candice Raymond is now working on Beirut as a cultural center. And she wrote a piece of paper that we co-edited and published with my colleagues at the ULB on academic freedom. And she published a work on the Arab Institute of Development, who was based in Beirut and financed by Libya, and where Fawaz Trabulsi, for instance, was a researcher, and it was for enhancing social science and human science and political science for a new Pan-Arab project. But they did what they want, and it was total freedom, but because the Libyan government didn't look at what they were writing. And I think maybe, I don't know, it's just an intuition, that all those thinkers that were publishing in those like Munif or Sayer, they were maybe sometimes publishing articles that were against the policy of the government that were financing their publishing house or their journal or their weekly. So it's just a thought of maybe it was total freedom because nobody cared in the government to read what they were writing.
Great. Should I jump in and answer? Catherine, John, yeah, absolutely. Law is really important. And some of those 1950s cases that have to do with offshore and definitions of offshore and ownership and sovereignty and stuff like that, I also discuss in my shipping book, because I was really interested in the way that they fit into discussions also of maritime movement, freedom upon the seas, et cetera, et cetera. So, and yeah, I definitely want to do a lot of these arbitral cases. In fact, I wanted to do them when I wrote the shipping book, but I couldn't really kind of shoehorn them in. they just weren't quite relevant, with the exception of the 2 or 3 that I discussed. So that is going to be a place, in part because I think international law and actually even domestic law ends up becoming the vehicle for the processes by which, as I said, the common becomes private property, and power relations, power asymmetries are written into law, so that in some senses the politics of that are just really dodgy as hell. So yeah. Tom's question about petroleum conservation. So one of the things that I also want to write about, which I find fascinating is the way that the language of conservation came to have two different meanings. One was the environmental conservation, and one was conservation in order to essentially was actually cutting back, keeping the oil in the ground in order to keep the prices up. So and I when I was researching in the Exxon's archives in Austin, I noticed that Exxon used the confusion between those two concepts as a way of manipulating prices right around 1973. And so the question of conservation ended up becoming this thing where you have to read it every time contextually in order to understand what it is that they're talking about, because sometimes they are responding to sort of environmental concerns and conservation of energy and things like that, and sometimes they're meaning literally as just cutting production in order to keep prices up. And of course, the latter thing ends up becoming something that is, you see it a lot more in discussions after the 1970s, where there is a lot more awareness of the fact that if they cut back production, they will have, you know, they'll be able to sort of put pressure for getting better deals from, you know, from the American, European oil firms. So the question of conservation is going to be actually something that I'm going to talk about when I'm talking about that transition from the particular pricing that the corporations imposed to this very complex situation where pricing is being determined by lots of different actors in lots of different places, including, you know, financials or futures markets. One and Jihan's question. I mean, we of course know that a lot of these countries, Arab countries, paid for intellectuals of various sorts, and that the intellectuals that they paid for very often didn't do what the Arab countries wanted them to do. I mean, that was also true of loads of factions within PLO, for example, that got paid for by the Iraqis or the whatever, and they did whatever the hell they wanted to do and switched places whenever they needed to. So I'm not surprised at all that Fawaz Trablisi worked for some sort of a Libya Institute for Development and then wrote whatever he wanted to write, because of course, you know, that was money that was flowing freely, and these guys were, at least in the 1970s, were as much paying out of noblesse oblige than any particular sense of really strategic wanting to control intellectuals. One thing that is clear, though, is that in the case of Iraq and Abdurrahman Munif, I think it becomes unbearable, that degree of control to him. You know, the more you begin to see op-eds in the magazine written by Saddam Hussein, obviously forced to put in there, the less you see of Munif himself writing opinion pieces or editorials in it. And then he disappears in 1981. And so I think that there is a way in which also these guys didn't want to be controlled, and so as long as the money flowed and they wrote what they wanted to write, they did so. And then a point came at which some of them became co-opted fully and some completely escaped writing about oil.
Thank you. Just a little thing, Laleh, you were saying that at some point there is this transition, and as part of the transition, I don't know if this is irrelevant or not, but you say that all of a sudden the magazines start to include promotion material, as in, what is that about? Or
I suspect it's when the funding stops to flow, and so they have to move to an advertising model of publication. And what is really interesting is what ends up getting published. So some of these journals end up like publishing, like the weekly one starts publishing ads for like Rolex, you know, and British Petroleum, of course, is like the biggest. British Petroleum and Exxon/Esso are the biggest oil companies that are publishing ads in these journals, which is also quite interesting given the fact that a lot of these Arab oil companies were formerly subsidiaries, or at that point subsidiaries of BP, so, or partial subsidiary in consortiums with BP. So it is really interesting that BP has such a sort of massive advertising budget for these Arabic language magazines.
I was just seeing one of the magazines online on eBay, the Naftal Arab
Yeah.
with promotions from Boeing, the airplane company, and yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's like, it is quite interesting that some of them, as I said, Rolls-Royce and Rolexes start off in the 1970s, and then it's Boeing and, you know, the big sort of engineering companies and big shippers, and actually Japanese ship producers in the 1980s end up being, you know, shipwrights. So.
Okay, I don't know if anybody else has more questions of those that have managed to stay until now, or if you, Katayoun or Laleh, wanted to say something else.
All I want to say is I'm really excited to read Katayoun's next project. She's such a careful arguer, careful researcher. It's really great, and I look forward to reading it.
I think we're all really excited to see what's going to come from both projects, from both of you. Yeah. Anyway, I think it was really great to have you. Thank you for coming to Brussels virtually. And we hope that one day we'll manage to get enough funding to invite all the friends that we have around and make them come here, which is nicer than do online. But the online also allows this kind of events, and we're really happy to have the possibility to have people like you to share your new and exciting projects. So yeah, unless anybody else has anything to say, we really hope that you manage to come and join us for the next seminar, and we will be spamming you through our newsletter, and we hope you have a wonderful week. So thanks for coming. Thanks again, Laleh and Katayoun.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.